of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Steponaitis earned his A.B. from Harvard and his M.A. and Ph.D. from the University of Michigan. We'll hear from Vin first, followed by Tony, and then Lance. Help me welcome Vin Steponaitis.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, and thank you all for coming. You see that the title is Grand Village of the Natchez Indians, Past, Present, and Future. And so my colleagues and I have divided up this talk into those three parts. My job is to talk about the past. Tony Boudreaux will talk about the present, and Lance Harris will talk about the future. So it's really easy to keep track of who's doing what. And I really enjoy being back here, and those of you who heard me speak here last fall know that the two things I really love and two things I'm passionate about are the archaeology of the Natchez area and historical maps. And so today we'll get to talk about both of those things. And specifically what I'm going to do is to lay the groundwork to give you the background to understand the work that is being done now at the Grand Village, looking for a pair of missing mounds. And that's the work that's being done by Tony Boudreaux and his crew from Ole Miss. And then Lance will go ahead and talk about what our findings from this project mean for the future of the Grand Village. Well, let me see if I can get my slides started here. So, how many of you have been to the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians? There's a few of you have been there. Quite a few of you have been there. And so if you walk out to the site, if you walk past the museum and out to where the mounds are, right now what you see on the site are three mounds in a row. They're called A, B, and C. In Mexico, archaeologists name mounds like things like the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. We just call them A, B, and C. So there's A, B, and C, and they're in a kind of north-south line. And for years, this is what all archaeologists and people who went to the site thought that this site looked like. But we now have reason to believe that this isn't the entire picture, as I'll explain in a few minutes. So let me, the key to this sort of new version of our understanding of the site are a set of maps that were made by the French in the early 1700s. So let me just start by giving you a little background of what happened in the Grand Village and what happened in Natchez in the early 1700s. Now, as many of you know, the French arrive in this part of the Mississippi Valley in 1682. La Salle takes his expedition down from Illinois, down the Mississippi, stops at Natchez, spends a little bit of time there, and then continues on and makes it all the way to the mouth of the Mississippi, to the Gulf of Mexico. After that short venture, and of course he came back upriver to go home, after that short venture, the French don't come back for a good while, and it isn't until 1699 that Iberville sails across the Gulf of Mexico and finds the Birdfoot Delta, and then the French start going upriver from the Gulf. By the early 1700s, you have missionaries that have established themselves at Natchez. Not long after that, the traders come and they start trading with the Indians. And in 1716, the French build a fort at Natchez called Fort Rosalie. After the fort is built, the colony takes off. And in the 1720s, you have several hundred French and I think about 200 African slaves who have established themselves in and amongst the Indians at Natchez. And the French colony that started at Natchez was one where the French and the Indians were just living side by side. The Natchez kind of welcomed the French into their midst. And this colony thrived in the 1720s. But through that decade, there were always tensions between the French and the Indians that kind of simmered just beneath the surface, and sometimes they would kind of simmer up to the top. And toward the end of the 1720s, a new French commandant was installed at the fort, a man named Chapard, who nobody liked. The French didn't like him. The Indians didn't like him. He wasn't very diplomatic. He was the kind of guy who was kind of more interested in building his own wealth and looking out for the interests of the colony. And in 17 1729, things really boiled over. The Natchez decided they didn't want the French there at all. They attacked the colony. They killed almost all the men. They took most of the women and African slaves captive. This happened in November of 1729. Word gets down to New Orleans, and the French mount an expedition to go back upriver to try to recover the prisoners that the Natchez had taken and also to punish the Natchez Indians. So in December of 1729, a French expeditionary force, it consisted of soldiers and a settler militia, starts moving upstream. They took their time, and of course the Natchez know that this is coming. So what the Natchez did was they built a pair of forts near the Grand Village so that they'd have a place to retreat to when the French arrive. And when the French come in February of 1730, they find, this is what they see, and this is a map made by a Frenchman. I suspect it was Ignace Francois Broutin, and this is a copy of a map that Broutin may have made. But in any case, what you see on this map are the two forts that the Indians built, one on either side of St. Catherine's Creek. And then this is the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians. These are the mounds that marked the Grand Village. And of course, the Grand Village was the capital of the Natchez Nation. It's where the paramount chief of the Natchez Indians lived and all the high-ranking officials. So what the French did is that they took up positions on and around the mounds, and they began to dig a sap, a siege trench, to get their artillery as close as they could to the two forts so they could attack the two forts. To make a longer story short, essentially what happened is as the French were approaching the forts, there were a number of skirmishes that were fought. The Indians were shooting at the French were shooting at the Indians. There was a lot of, we know that the French officers weren't all on the same page because after the battle they're all blaming the other for what happened. But essentially what happens at the end is just as the French get close to the fort, the Natchez Indians escape from the forts and leave. And they later went up to Sicily Island where a year later another battle was fought. But in any case, the siege ended with most of the Natchez warriors escaping from the siege, but the French did recover the prisoners that the Natchez had taken. So that's kind of the short version of the battle. And so we have two maps that were made by the French at the time. And essentially, I think these are both copies of an original map that has since been lost. This one is in the National Library in Paris. This version of the map, it's decorated a little differently, but it's essentially the same map, now resides at the Historic New Orleans Collection, just not too far from here, just south of here. So these are kind of contemporary maps that show the Grand Village, they show the Indian forts, and they show the relationship between the two. So hold that thought. This gentleman right here is an archaeologist who was one of my mentors when I was a student, a man named Robert S. Neitzel, who, when he worked for the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, dug at the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians twice, once in 1962 and again in 1972. I first met Stu when he was digging at the Grand Village the second time in 1972. And this is a photo I took of him in Vicksburg when he was in the field with us. We were going out and digging in the field. He stayed home, and he was working on the second of his two books on the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians at the time. And so that's why he's surrounded by three-ring binders and all his notes as he was working on this manuscript. While he was there, and I was just, I was like a 20-year-old kid, that whole summer, Stu was complaining about this map. He knew about this map, but it really vexed him. And the reason it vexed him is that if you look at the way the mounds are arranged, they're arranged in a kind of a diamond pattern, which is completely different from the arrangement of the mounds that you now see at the Grand Village. Remember that first slide I showed? There were just 3 mounds in a straight line. This shows not 3 mounds, but 4 mounds in a diamond pattern. And he was trying to figure out how to reconcile this map with the lay of the land at the Grand Village the way we know it today. So anyway, in his two books, this is the one he published in 1965, he mentions the map, but he sort of dismisses it. He said, well, they often got it wrong, and so we're just not going to worry about it too much. But by the time he was working on the second book, he was really starting to think about it some more, and he was turning the map this way and that way and trying to figure out how to reconcile it with the landscape as he knew it. And in the book, this is his illustration from the book. He came to the conclusion that whoever made this map got the north arrow wrong. And so if you turn the map 90 degrees and you squint and you give it a little bit of artistic license, maybe it fits. But it still doesn't really fit very well. So this is where things stood until a few years ago, when another map turns up. This is a map that's been in the National Library in Paris for many, many years, but a local historian in Natchez, Smoky Joe Frank, found it on the French National Library's website and shared it, and we started looking at it. And this is an incredibly accurate map made by the engineer Broutin in 1723 of the entire Natchez colony. And we're going to zoom in to a little detail right here, okay? That's where he shows the Grand Village. So this, and Broutin, I got to tell you, is a first-rate engineer. If Broutin made a map, you could take it to the bank. I mean, he's always right on target. And he shows a bunch of mounds, but he doesn't show just 3 mounds, he shows 6. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 mounds. So clearly, there were more mounds there than today meet the eye. And this is A, B, and C. These are the 3 mounds we see today, but there's 3 more. So here they're labeled, and these are my labels, not Broutin's, D, E, and F. Okay. So I was looking at this map and suddenly I thought, well, let me hold that up side by side with that 1730 map, the one with the diamond-shaped pattern. And lo and behold, that solves the mystery. Because if you notice over here, well, let's look at this diamond pattern. You've got these 4 mounds in a diamond pattern. You've got 4 mounds in a diamond pattern here, and the other 2 mounds are just off the edge of the map. So in this map, he showed 4 of the 6 mounds, and they're actually all in the correct relative positions, and the other 2 just didn't matter because they were outside the place where the action was during the battle. So the light bulb went on and said, okay, so we now have more mounds, and not only do we have more mounds, but we kind of know where they should be. So this is a map that was made in 1973, right after the Grand Village came into being, right after the mounds were landscaped, and it shows, it's an accurate map made by a local engineering firm that shows mounds A, B, and C as they appeared in 1973. We can take that French map and just kind of overlay it. We scale it, we turn it so north is up, and we overlay it so that the locations of mounds B and C on the French map match up with mounds B and C on the modern map. And if we line it up with these 2 mounds, we have an idea of where to look for these missing mounds. So if we take away, if we sort of put it together, these are the 3 mounds we can see. There should be 2 more mounds there, and they should be somewhere around here. And the French sap, the siege trench, would have been sort of heading off to the west. This is actually a neighborhood of houses right nearby. So this gave us something to look for, and it gave us a place to look. And Tony will describe how we've been looking for these additional mounds. But before I do that, let's just sort of zoom in a little bit and look at some of these mounds again. The French told us on their maps what some of these mounds were used for. This is to get north to point up. I had to turn this map upside down because the French didn't really care about north being up the way we do back in the 1800s. So each mound is annotated. It's very light ink, but I'm just writing out a little bit more clearly what the maps say. So this mound, Mound C, is Temple Neuf, the new temple. The missing mound, Mound D, is Vieux Temple, the old temple. So there was a new temple and an old temple. Stu Neitzel, when he wrote his book, correctly identified this as the new temple, but we didn't know that an old temple existed. So we've got the new temple, the old temple, and then again, Stu Neitzel was right. Mound B is identified on this map as Cabane du Grand Chef, and as the cabin of the Grand Chief. It's where the paramount chief, the Great Sun, lived. And this mound is unlabeled and also doesn't have any buildings on it. These buildings are these red squares. So in 1723, this mound seemed to be empty on top. That didn't have a structure on it. If we fast forward to the first 1730 map, these are the same mounds. This is the Temple of the Natchez. Again, that's the new temple, and you can see the building clearly. This one is Vieux Temple Abandonné, the old temple abandoned. So by this time, maybe the old temple was abandoned, but it couldn't have been abandoned very long because there was still a building up there. These wooden post buildings don't last very long because the wood will rot out. So this confirms the uses of those two mounds in the earlier map. This just says battery with two pieces. The French had their artillery on top of this mound, so we still don't know exactly what it was used for. And then if we go fast forward to the other map of the battle, the one that's in the Historic New Orleans collection, this map is labeled with how the French used the mounds. So G in the caption, this was basically their headquarters. The commanding officer moved into the new temple during the battle. F in their legend says the injured. So they use the old temple probably as a kind of a field hospital. And then this one is just, it's labeled temple. So maybe this once had a temple on it, but again, there's no real building on it. What you see on this mound is a kind of a parapet or an embankment that the French put up, I suspect, during the battle. So we now know, based on the maps, that there had to be more mounds out there, and the maps gave us the search area, the place to look for those mounds. And if we can find those mounds, we know the sap trench starts at the base of one of them. That sap trench is heading right for one of the forts. Ultimately, we hope to not only find the two mounds, but find the sap trench and find the forts. But I'm going to stop there and let Tony take up the story.
So my colleague, Stephen Harris, and I are at the University of Mississippi, and we were invited to be a part of this project by Lance and Vin, and they've been thinking about this project for a long time, and ultimately what they were hoping to do, and what we were sort of brought on board to sort of help them do, is to try to use that French map to sort of look for elements of the landscape that were associated with this battle in 1730. And I have some of these images up here to illustrate how ironic it is that at one of the best known archaeological sites, one of the most extensively excavated sites in the state of Mississippi, and at a place where we have all of these extraordinary 18th century French accounts of activities that took place, that there's so much that we don't know about this place. How do you not know two mounds are out there? So even in situations where we think we know, and we do know so much about a place, there's still much more to be learned. And just to give you sort of a little bit of the lay of the land, get my pointer right. So here are the three mounds that are visible today, mounds A, B, and C. Vin's hypothesized location of these missing mounds. And this image right here is a photograph that is taken from the top of this mound, and it's looking in this direction. And Vin just mentioned that there's a neighborhood that's located adjacent to the Grand Village. So you see a fence that's basically the western edge of the Grand Village property, and then you've got this neighborhood to the west. And this image up here is a LiDAR image, and what you need to know about this is that the lighter areas in this image indicate higher elevations, darker areas indicate lower elevations. And if you see this sort of dark bowl-shaped area, this is an area that was essentially scooped out with heavy equipment in the 1970s, 1972. Stu Neitzel, who Vin just talked about, he was interested in excavating areas around the mounds. And during his mound excavations, he had realized that the Grand Village, and indeed sort of the whole area surrounding Grand Village, had been, during the 19th century, had been covered with some pretty significant flood deposits. St. Catherine Creek runs sort of all along all around the site. And as St. Catherine Creek flooded in the 19th century, it deposited silt on the site. And that silt accumulated to a pretty significant depth. Stu Neitzel figured out that there was approximately 5 to 6 feet of silt covering this entire site. So if you've been to Grand Village today, or even if you haven't, you see these maps, we knew about 3 of these mounds, largely because they had been essentially tall enough to be sticking out above this silt when it was deposited, so that folks knew to come back and kind of dig out around those mounds to expose them. This area over here, and what you're seeing right there, that's one of those streets in the neighborhood. That's a street in the neighborhood as well. But this is on Grand Village property, and this area is much higher than this area. So the idea, how do you lose 2 mounds? Well, what we think happened is that as St. Catherine Creek flooded throughout the 19th century, basically those mounds were small enough that they were covered over with silt, so that when you look out at the landscape today, it's basically just a nice flat area. And so Vin was able to identify a pretty sort of small, compact search area. And that search area was kind of this field that's to the west of the mounds that we know about. At the University of Mississippi, we have a lot of equipment that allows us to do surveys that kind of allow us to peek underneath the ground without doing any disturbance to the ground. We call these geophysical instruments. Probably the one that most people know about is something called the ground penetrating radar, the GPR. GPR was kind of the only piece of equipment we could use in this case because it gets to the depth that we thought we needed to go to. We suspected those mounds were probably buried by about 6 feet of silt. And so here are some folks from Ole Miss doing the GPR survey, and you can see the existing mounds, the mounds we know about in the background, but yet here we are in this flat area sort of looking for mounds. And the results of the GPR, one thing about the GPR, it's going to show you lots of things that are underneath the ground. Not all of those are of archaeological interest. So for example, we've got sort of a drainage system, high pressure gas line, tree roots. But my colleague Stephen Harris is the GPR whiz, and in processing all of these data, he sort of identified something in this area that kind of nice and round, and Stephen said, "Let's look at that." And I trusted Stephen because I don't know what any of this means. I said, "Sure, let's look at that." And that's what we did. Actually, I'll skip over this one. The first way we looked at this potential mound location was to bring in a coring rig, truck-mounted coring rig, and some of our colleagues from Louisiana were kind enough to come over and spend a couple of days with us at Grand Village doing some coring. And what they were able to figure out is that the silt that's been deposited on the site there's a pretty clear distinction between that silt and areas that were sort of modified by humans. So we were looking for these changes in those cores, and we were able to find an area that really looked like where a mound was located and buried. So we followed up with that coring with some excavations last July, and our idea was to look in the area where we thought that mound might be, where the coring indicated that it was going to be. We wanted to try to put some units that would fall on top of that buried mound, and some units that would kind of fall on one slope of that buried mound. So if you think of a mound as a flat top, slopes down the side, we wanted a unit on top to kind of see what was going on top of the mound, and something on the side. And the one on the side, the goal with it was to try to recover artifacts, recover burned pieces of plant remains that we could date to sort of see when that mound had been built. And you've got to keep in mind when we're planning to dig to the top and dig to the bottom of this mound, you can't actually see the mound. I mean, it's just sort of flat ground that you're looking at. And so what you're looking at here is a small unit we put in the area that we thought would be on top of the mound, and it was. We were very fortunate. We knew we were on top of the mound because we had a sort of nice flat surface, and we also were able to find part of a building that was on top of that mound. And what you're looking at right here, that trench that's dug out, and here it is, you see the lighter soil that is that trench before it was dug out. That is a linear trench that was dug, and then wooden posts would have been set up in that trench to form the walls of a structure. And so we were able to find, indeed, the top of the mound, top of the buried mound, and to get a building on it. And finding that building, or part of that building, is important because it helps us kind of orient that mound. These are the units that we excavated kind of into the side of the mound, to the slope. And the goal here is to recover artifacts and something for radiocarbon dating so we can figure out when the mound was built. We knew from the cores that we had about 4 feet of silt on top of this mound. So we brought in a backhoe, and all that silt, there's nothing archaeological in there. That's relatively recent. So we brought in this backhoe to get that silt off the top of what we were interested in. And as we got closer to where we knew the mound was buried, we shifted to shovels. And it's kind of hard to see, but there's kind of a dark band right there. That's where we're starting to get down to the top of this buried mound. And here we have folks doing some excavations there, happy diggers, because people ask you all the time as an archaeologist, what's the coolest thing you've ever found? And we inevitably disappoint them. But when you can say, well, actually, we found a buried mound that nobody knew about, or one person knew about, that's kind of cool. And so everybody's happy. And you can see these extraordinary layers of silt that were deposited. So presumably we have all sorts of flooding events, all these different layers. But when you get to about right there, from this layer right here, we interpreted, or actually, this layer sort of right in here, we think that's kind of wash, things that sort of washed off the top of the mound and got redeposited. But once we start getting into here, that very dark layer right there, we think that is undisturbed mound fill. And we know that these mounds were sort of built up in layers, and we can see those layers very clearly in our excavations. If we kind of go from oldest to youngest, this dark layer right here is probably the undisturbed ground surface that whenever this mound was first built, we're speculating here because we don't have any dates yet, but maybe sometime in the 1300s, this would have been the ground surface. That sloped layer right there is sort of the first stage of mound construction. So soils would have been brought in, this mound would have been built up, that mound would have had a nice flat top, probably had one or more buildings on top of it, probably important people living on top of this building. And then the activities on top of that building included basically the consumption of a lot of food. And so we've got this trash layer that was thrown down the slope of that mound. And that trash layer is full of pottery, full of burned plant remains, full of fish remains, gar scales, lots of fish vertebra. So sort of lots of good eating right here. And then we have another layer of mound construction. So we have at least 2 layers in which this mound was built up. And you can really see that sort of trash layer here, mound stage, and the original ground surface there. So we're very confident that we found one of those missing mounds. These red rectangles show you the mounds that we know about today, A, B, C. This summer, we were able to excavate and determine the location of what we presumed at the time was this northern of those missing mounds. This last week, we've been working out at Grand Village, Stephen Harris and Gracie Ream. We've been working out at Grand Village, and we've been looking in the area south. We know we've got a mound here, so we've been looking in this area to the south. And we've been doing some coring, really sort of small, kind of 1-inch cores systematically across the area where we thought this other missing mound might be. And we're pretty confident we've found the location of the second missing mound. We can't really know for sure until we actually put some units in it, which we don't have plans to do that right now. But as best we can tell, we've we may have the location of that second missing mound. And finding the location of this second missing mound is critical because, as Vin was saying earlier, if you can orient these French maps to some of these landscape features, then we can now start to do things like project the location of that sap, project the location of where those Natchez forts might be. And if the area in the neighborhood has sort of 5 to 6 feet of silt above it like Grand Village does, and there's no reason to think it's not, this sap and these forts may be sort of protected and buried out under that silt somewhere. So just to summarize very quickly, we think we found the two buried mounds. We've not found the sap yet, but we have plans to go do some GPR survey in the neighborhood adjacent to Grand Village because we have some areas where we think that sap may be running. And this is a crew shot from last summer where they're pointing out that it's time to update the historic marker at Grand Village because we've got 3 mounds out there, but well, at that time we just had another missing mound. Now we've got 2 missing mounds. So the mound trail sign needs to be updated at Grand Village, and then I'll pass this off to Lance right now.
Can you hear me now? I guess you can. I was just saying thank you to Vin Steponaitis, Tony, and Stephen for going down this road with us. I'll also say thank you to the National Park Service. We were able to get an American Battlefield Protection Program grant to do this research. It's very exciting, and we're looking forward to taking this information and utilizing it for the future. Before I tell you about the future plans for the Grand Village, I am going to give you a little historical context just so you know how important the past is for what we want to do at the future at the Grand Village. Vin started off by asking many of you how many had come to the Grand Village site. How many of you have been to Natchez before? Just about everybody in the room. Now, when you come to Natchez, you probably think palatial mansions, the antebellum South, are certainly popular spring pilgrimage with hoop skirts and the pageantry and everything. I would posit that when you think of Natchez, you really should think of the Grand Village. Vin mentioned earlier the accounts of LaSalle and Iberville in 1682 and 1700. Interestingly of note, both of those men came to the Natchez vicinity in March. LaSalle 1682, Iberville in 1700. The accounts are that they landed their canoes and they made their way inland several leagues to visit the great son, the big chief of the Natchez people. The place that he visited was the village of Natchez, the grand village of the Natchez Indians, the very first Natchez before the palatial city of Natchez came into existence much later in time. In 1700, the Iberville makes note of about 9 villages in the Natchez vicinity. This information was given to him by a Tensas Indian, who was probably related in some way, shape, or form to the Natchez people. You can see a mere 20 years later, there's only really about 4 to 6 villages that are being notated on a consistent basis in the French colonial accounts. Those early colonists, when they come to the Natchez vicinity, they're encountering a people that are unlike other Native Americans, other indigenous people in the Southeast. They still lived at a mound center, which is certainly of note. They practiced a way of life where they had a big chief, the great son, who was described as having authoritarian power over the villages in his area where they paid tribute to him. They kind of bent to his will. Here's a depiction done by Lepage de Prats in his 1758 publication, History of Louisiana, showing the transport of the great son. Some accounts say that his feet never touched the ground. And there are other various accounts of the Natchez people. One item of note, this image over here, again from Lepage de Pratt's, shows the funeral procession of the tattooed serpent, who was the brother of the great son and kind of the big war chief and chief diplomat of the Natchez people. You'll notate the human sacrifice that's occurring in this image so that the tattooed serpent is able to have retainers in the afterlife. These kind of practices were not being done by other Native Americans in the Southeast, and it's a particular note because it was happening so late into the historic period. We've talked extensively about the battlefield at the Grand Village and how important these maps are to our current research purposes and also our future endeavors as well too. One item of note about this though is this battle, it happened at the Grand Village site. Now we know that certainly battles happen at other mound sites, but this is one of the most richly documented sites in North America, not just for the battle that occurred there, but for the way of life that the people that lived at this mound center. After the Natchez people left the Natchez vicinity in 1730, the area that now encompasses Adams County, it passed through a variety of different European powers' hands, ultimately becoming part of the United States of America. In short order, like many places throughout the South, it turned into plantation holdings. You can see this image of the Fatherland Plantation, as it was known at that point in time, in production for fields right here, and you can see the gentleman on top of a horse on top of one of the mounds at the Fatherland site. Before the 1962 and 1972 excavations undertaken by Stu Neitzel, Morrow Chambers also excavated at the site in 1930 in an excavation sponsored by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. While Chambers did not publish on his findings, James Ford did. Now, James Ford is considered one of the godfathers of southeastern archaeology, and he published analysis of Indian village site collections from Louisiana and Mississippi in 1936. In this publication, they made the connection that the Fatherland Plantation that they were excavating in 1930 was in fact the grand village of the Natchez Indians that was so richly documented by the French colonists. We've talked about Stu Neitzel, and again, you should know that he excavated in 1962 and 1972. If Ford was considered a godfather of southeastern archaeology, Neitzel would be considered a grandfather. And these two works that are published on the Grand Village are seen as his magnum opus. It was also during this 1960s and 70s time frame when the Grand Village took on some notification. In 1964, it was one of the first two sites added to the listing of National Historic Landmarks in Mississippi. And in 1966, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Now, those of you who have come to the Grand Village before, you know that when you turn off of Highway 61 onto Jefferson Davis Boulevard, you drive through a commercial corridor and a residential corridor before you come to the very end where the Grand Village is located. This area was being developed as early as the 1940s, but in the 1950s and 60s, it was really starting to become endangered. Grace McNeil, seen in this image here, who owned most of the site that contained the mounds on it, made a donation in 1970 to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History for about 35 acres. There's also a group of local concerned citizens that came together, led by Everett Truly, and they formed together, they pooled money, and they purchased another 50 acres or so, and it also came to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. The purpose for this donation was to create the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians as a public historic site that would be available to all Mississippians and people throughout the world. So in 1971, again, these donations that occur and the property is in the hands of the state of Mississippi. Plans started being developed for the Grand Village site. Now you can see here, this is a visitor center. This is a museum building. There's an amphitheater here, pavilions scattered throughout the park. People often ask how many acres we have at the Grand Village. We have 128 acres. On this side of the creek, there's about 85 acres. I like to think that this plan that was developed in 71 was probably modeled after Moundville in Alabama. Fast forwarding a few more years, this is a 1973 plan that was developed for the Grand Village. Again, you see a visitor center, a theater, museum, amphitheater, pavilions scattered throughout. This plan even calls for a swing bridge over St. Catherine's Creek. It's a beautiful plan, isn't it? The 1971 plan was beautiful as well. Unfortunately, the funding was not quite there for the full realization of those plans. And what we ended up with was a very modest visitor center, less than 4,000 square feet, a walking trail around the mounds, and historic markers, interpretive markers scattered throughout. In the 1980s, the staff at the Grand Village did build a pavilion near the main visitor center. And there have been some other developments that have occurred, but it has largely remained the same since the 1970s. And here's some early images of the Grand Village after it was first opened. You can notate the neighborhood over to the west. So we have 128 acres. We have a building that's less than 4,000 square feet, and we have an extremely active educational program at the Grand Village, as well as public program opportunities. You can see in this image here, this is a presentation by Vin actually at the Grand Village a year or two ago. We had about 100 people inside our auditorium that normally sits about 60 people. Here we have one of our many educational programs ongoing at the Grand Village. Here's some images of some exhibits that are still in the Grand Village today from about 1976. And then you see this image right here. What do you make a note of in that image? It doesn't look like it's at the Grand Village. And in fact, it's not. It is actually at a local gymnasium at a local school just down the road from the Grand Village. Once a year, the Grand Village plays host to the annual Natchez Powwow. We're having our 32nd annual powwow, March 28th and 29th this year. I invite you all to attend. Unfortunately, when that event occurs, it's often wet and muddy because, as we know, in Mississippi, March and April have a tendency to have some rain. And when that occurs, we have to take our largest annual event to an off-site location. This event, when it occurs at the Grand Village, normally brings about 3,000 to 4,000 people to the Grand Village over a 2-day period. When we have to take it off-site, it dramatically affects our attendance and the way we're able to conduct our business at the Grand Village. We knew these limitations, but we did partner up with a Different View, who's a consulting firm out of Tennessee, to come up with a visitor experience and operational assessment report. They came up with some things. Some of the highlights that I pulled out are welcome orientation needs to be revamped. On our capacity, we could sense that the museum would be too small of a space to have both school groups and the general tourist. And the Visitor Center Museum needs a complete revamp, and it needs to tie into an overarching interpretive plan. While that was going on, we also began working on our new research. Again, I make note of Vin's ongoing research. He published The Grand Village of the Natchez Indians Was Indeed Grand, a reconsideration of the fatherland site landscape with Ian Brown in 2017 in Forging Southeastern Identities. And he really made note of the 6 mounds that potentially are at the site instead of the 3 that you see today. Moving that forward, we had the research project that Tony talked about, and that is an ongoing project. We anticipate taking the research and being able to use it for new interpretations at the Grand Village. And part of that new interpretation of the Grand Village also needs to make note of the native voice. The 1970s exhibits that are at the Grand Village today have a painful lack of the native voice located throughout those exhibits, and that is something that we need to address in the future. With that native voice concern and the new modern research, we have begun working on a new interpretive plan at the Grand Village. It was created a couple of years ago. We have had one go through of review with a Different View, and we anticipate this May having consultations with Native American nations, academics, and the local community in the Natchez vicinity. Some of the highlights that have come out of this interpretive plan review are new vision and mission statements and themes. I'll hit on the vision statement, honoring the original Natchez. We came up with this because, one, we want to honor the site of the original Natchez, the physical location, the Grand Village, but also the original inhabitants, the Natchez people themselves. We have also begun working with architectural firms to reimagine what the Grand Village could look like in the future. We have begun some fundraising efforts to generate funds to begin on our project. And here is a mock-up done by Madge Bemis Architects based out of Virginia. You see the existing 4,000 square foot Grand Village Visitor Center, but we anticipate building a new interpretive center complete with new exhibits, new retail operations, new classrooms. And we also want to create a new pavilion as well too that can host our larger educational groups and our large events such as the Natchez Powwow when inclement weather comes down in the Natchez Bluffs vicinity. Exhibits will certainly be a new part of the new Grand Village of the Natchez Indians. These are just some images from other sites in the southeast, Moundville, and Cahokia in the Midwest as well too. The work that's being done right now on the actual battlefield site and some of the missing features in the landscape are important to us so we can notate those items as we have new interpretations at the Grand Village. One item that we're thinking about looking at in the future is creating ghost mound exhibits, so when you're on the physical landscape, you can have an approximation of where those structures would have been on the landscape. We also anticipate bringing in 3 sister gardens to tell a more complete and accurate story of the way of life for the Natchez people. And redoing our interpretive nature trail as well by utilizing the iconography of pre-contact Native America, as well as the multitude of information related from the French colonists related to the flora and fauna in the lower Mississippi Valley. One item of note about the Grand Village that's important. You have a mound site here that had a living, active people in it well into the historic era. By doing so, you had a multitude of French colonial accounts of the mound site itself, the structures on top of the mounds, and the activities that people were doing at these mound sites. You have that corroborated by archaeological evidence, and in the case of the Temple Mound here, a drawing of a structure on top of the mounds. This is unique in North America. There is simply no other place like it. It's right here in the lower Mississippi Valley at the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians. We think and hope that it'll be appropriate that we put structures back on top of the mounds in the near future. This idea certainly was not new to me. It was actually something that Stu Neitzel had in the 1970s when he worked on developing the historic site to open up to the public. And here is some imagery from an upcoming virtual reality exhibit that is going to be happening at the Grand Village. This is the Temple Mound, and this is the Great Sons Mound. You can see the structures on top of them. In hopefully a little bit over a month's time, we will have a virtual reality exhibit that you can download from Time Looper that shows the Grand Village as it would have looked in the 1720s. We're very excited about this. In addition, in the near future, we'll have all new exterior exhibits scattered throughout the Grand Village site. So please come within the next couple of months to see our new additions at the site. And then we also, again, want to create that pavilion so we can have a place not only for our local big events, but also that we can utilize for facility use and engage people to come out to the Grand Village and utilize it as their public park as well. And this is an artistic rendering of the entrance to the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians, showing the existing building, the new exhibit center, and the new pavilion. Now with that, I'm going to invite my colleagues, Vin and Tony, to come back up, and we will field any questions that you might have. If you do have a question, please raise your hand, and a microphone will be brought to you to answer these questions.
Dr. Steponaitis, you mentioned Sicily Island. Can either of you speak to Sicily Island today? I know it's a rich geological site, but it's also the birthplace of my maternal grandmother and her mother.
Okay. So I don't know much about the geology of Sicily Island, but I do know what happened there in the year after the battle I just described. So most of the Natchez warriors and their families escaped the siege in 1730 at Natchez, and they, as far as the French are concerned, they vanish. Where are they? So the French start looking for them, and they start getting reports that the Natchez have established new forts up somewhere in the Washita drainage. So the French are looking for them. And a year later, I think based on this intelligence, they send another army from New Orleans that went up the Tensas River and found a fort of the Natchez. Once again, they laid siege to it. Once again, most of the Natchez escaped, but they did take some Natchez prisoners, including the great son at the time. And the prisoners they took were brought back to New Orleans and sold into slavery in the Caribbean. Now, the French declared a great victory. It was a little bit, we've seen this in recent history. You think you've won, but actually the majority of the Natchez warriors escaped that siege, and they continued to attack the French over the years. And in fact, they went and moved the Natchez refugees. Some of them moved in with the Chickasaws. The French fought two disastrous wars in the 1730s against the Chickasaws to punish the Chickasaws for harboring the Natchez, but it actually was the other way around. The French were defeated both times. And the Natchez now, they're descendants of the Natchez that live among the Creek Nation in Oklahoma, among the Oklahoma Cherokees, as well as with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and two state-recognized tribes in South Carolina. So there was a kind of a diaspora of Natchez people. But Sicily Island was where the second battle took place a year after this one, and that was kind of the same story.
At the beginning of part 3, there was a slide shown that listed a number of villages, and one of those was Tugulas, which is remarkably similar to the name of Tougaloo College, just north of here. And I wonder if anybody's explored the relationship of that. Was one named after the other, I guess was my question.
So the village Tougaloo most likely was a village of two Indians who were not ancestral to the Natchez vicinity. They probably came down from somewhere in the what's now the Mississippi Delta area as refugees and established a village among the Natchez sometime prior to 1723. We do know that they left that area in 1727. And I think that there's accounts of two Indians being in the vicinity where Tougaloo College is as well, too.
Part of the similarity is that Gula means people. So the two people. And so they're probably not related, but it's just probably a coincidence. But the Gula is what you hear, and that you'll see that as part of the name of many different Indian towns across the South who spoke Muskogean, Western Muskogean languages.
I was wondering if it was right beside St. Catherine's Creek. Did these mounds have anything to do with flooding? In other words, getting above it? No. And I wonder why it flooded enough in the 19th century to fill in 5 feet, but it hadn't before that. Did it not flood in the 18th, and 17th, and 16th?
You want to take that? Yeah, I'll take that. I'll answer that in reverse order. The reason that there's so much sedimentation and flooding is because of the changes in the landscape that took place after the Europeans moved in, cut down all the trees, and started planting cotton. And so, there was just a lot of changes to the hydrology of that area that had to do with the changes in land use. And then, of course, a little bit later in time, someone had the idea of shortening the path of St. Catherine's Creek. And they cut a new path to the Mississippi River that shortened it. And that created a situation that you see today, which is that St. Catherine's Creek now is like in a deep ravine. It's downcut. I think it's large-scale agriculture that caused the greater sedimentation after the Natchez left.
Thank you so much for taking my question. My question is, Mississippi history in general, my statement is it's a very sensitive history, a very emotional history. I'm interested to know what exactly are you looking for by exploring these mounds? Anything that hasn't been found already that they use it for, like the like Egypt, the mounds in Egypt called the pyramids. What exactly are you looking for? And there is a mound that we visited in Louisiana. Very tall. It's very spiritual. It's in Poverty Point, Louisiana. Very spiritual. So are you looking for some treasure or something magical to stop aging?
Would you like me to handle that, or Yeah, it's a good question. I've been doing archaeology for almost 50 years. I've never found any treasure or anything like that. And of course, I guess my answer to your question generally is that what archaeologists do is exactly the same thing that historians do. You know, people, if you see Indiana Jones movies, you get the sense that what archaeologists are trying to do is find like some golden statue or temple. But in reality, the point of archaeology is not like making finds. The point of archaeology is people, trying to understand how people lived in the past, trying to understand how people's lifeways changed over time. So we're doing exactly the same thing that historians do. We just use a different line of evidence. Historians use the written word. They use newspapers. They use letters that people wrote and so forth. But if you look at the course of human history, only the amount of time that people have been doing writing is like the tiniest tip of the iceberg. If I did a timeline across the front of the room of the 2 million years that people have lived on this planet, writing appears in the last 2 inches. So for most of human history, you can only see it by studying the things that people left behind and trying to understand, reconstruct their way of life. So that's the general answer. More specifically, when we're looking for mounds in this part of the world, mounds were religious buildings. They were also political buildings. And when you look at a mound, think of it as fossilized labor. These mounds were built completely by hand. There were no front-end loaders. There were no steam shovels. Every one of these mounds, like the one at Poverty Point, which is more than 3,000 years old, were built by people picking up basket loads of earth and piling them down. That took leadership. And so when you see mounds appearing archaeologically, what that's telling us is that the politics is getting much more complex. You're getting leadership. So studying mounds is like studying ancient politics and studying ancient religion. It's the way we get at those aspects of how people lived.
We've come to the top of another hour. I know there were a few more questions, but I'm sure our panelists will be happy to answer those in person afterwards. We have copies of the archaeological reports on the Grand Village over here for sale, as well as some lovely baskets. Thank you all for coming. I hope that we see you back here next week. Don't forget that this Saturday is the free day at the museums. For now, help me thank Tony Boudreaux, Lance Harris, and Vin Steponaitis for this program today.